Hello guys, Crispy here, welcome back to another video. In this one, my friends, I'm gonna be testing a GeForce RTX 4070 Super in Hellblade 2. This one is the Founders Edition model of the card. We are running it with the latest Nvidia drivers, and I'm not manually overclocking it. You can see all of its specs right here in Tech Power-Ups. GPU Z-Resizable bar is also enabled, and over on the left, we're pairing it with a Ryzen 9 7950X3D with half of its cores disabled, which is basically the same as a Ryzen 7 7800X3D. And over on the memory tab, we're using 32GB of DDR5 6000 MHz RAM in dual channel CL30. Let's get into it, shall we? Alright, let's go over the settings first. I'm starting at 1080p resolution using DLAA, that's native resolution, and the high settings preset, which are the maximum settings in this game. It can't go higher on any of these individual settings. I'm also going to test it at 1440p and 4K resolutions, always with the maximum settings, because I want to push the graphics card to the maximum. It's kind of like a benchmark, you know, this game. It's very intensive indeed, and well, I'm not using like optimized settings, medium settings and stuff like that, because I just want to see what these GPUs are capable of at maximum settings in a UE5 title with all of the bells and whistles enabled, basically. Also, if you're wondering about DLAA, I've seen a couple of comments in the last video saying that that's way more intensive, you're losing a ton of FPS by using DLAA. That's not true, okay? Disregard those comments if you've seen those, because as you can see right now, we're getting 68 FPS with DLAA enabled, and if I go over to the graphics settings, disable this, set it to TSR, and well, disable dynamic resolution scale and stuff, so it's native res once again using TSR, it actually is lower. What the heck? Okay. And it also looks quite a bit softer than DLAA, so just leave DLAA enabled, guys. Alright, it gets you a couple of more FPS, interestingly. Last time that I tried it, it was back there, and I was getting exactly the same FPS with TSR and DLAA. So, yeah, let's start counting the FPS once again. Now, after the cutscene, this scene over here is a little bit more intensive. Instead of getting 70s, we're now in the 60s. This is also doing quite a bit better of a job than the RTX 3080 Ti, which is nice to see, and kind of unexpected, because these GPUs are very similar in performance usually. Even Nvidia says that the 4070 Super should be on par with the RTX 3090, which is around like 2 to 3% faster than the 3080 Ti. This also has 12GB of VRAM. That doesn't really make any difference whatsoever when you compare it to the 3090 in this particular title, because this game, thankfully, even though it looks absolutely insane, it doesn't consume a lot of VRAM, as you can see, especially at 1080p, of course. But even at 4K resolution, 12GB are enough to max out this game in terms of VRAM. Obviously, in terms of GPU power, at 4K, it will struggle. Obviously, it's already getting 60-ish FPS right here at 1080p resolution, and for such an expensive card like this one, yeah, it's not really that impressive. But you gotta remember that this is absolute maxed out settings. If you used optimized settings, you could extract like 10-20 frames more from your GPU here. Ooh, it's dropping into the 50s, just like the RTX 3080 Ti did over here. Although that GPU dropped into the lower 50s, this one is in the mid to high 50s most of the time. Still, guys, you can't really get 60 plus FPS 100% of the time here in Senua's Hellblade 2 with the 4070 Super. That's actually insane. So yeah, that's about it for the test at 1080p resolution. There are areas that will be slightly more intensive than the ones that we just tried, but most of the time it's actually going to achieve the same or slightly higher frames, especially during the first hour or so of the game. So yeah, that's it. Now, thankfully, with this GPU, we got frame generation, so you don't need to use quality DLSS if you want to get 60 plus FPS 100% of the time. Of course, that will give you that, but it also will give you slightly more shimmery, slightly worse quality visual experience, you know? Yeah, I can definitely notice that some things are, like the grass, are a little bit blurrier and so on. The smoke effects are also super pixelated, as you can see, and that's essentially because this is rendering the game now at 720p resolution because of DLSS quality and 1080p native res. So I'm gonna go back to DLAA and enable frame generation instead, which should look a bit better. The smoke is still a bit pixelated, not as much as it was in DLSS Quality, of course, and right now we're getting way over 100 frames per second, 120s, right? Whew, that is absolutely insane, actually. Damn. Okay. Yeah, and I can see that there is a bit more aliasing as well, maybe. I mean, maybe it's not aliasing, maybe it's just a little bit of more noise than native resolution, but it's not to the point where it matters too much, especially with all of this motion blur enabled. You can only disable that in the config files. Yeah, it doesn't look too bad, and I don't think it's a deal breaker to play like this, guys, with frame generation enabled. So if you want that high refresh rate experience at 1080p, it's going to achieve that with the frame generation. It looks pretty similar to the native resolution stuff. I'm just curious to see if there are some artifacts around, like the birds and so on, the particle effects flying around. Not really. Okay, no ghosting or anything. Actually, when you enable DLSS Quality here, you can notice a lot of ghosting in these like bugs flying around. Is that what they are? Probably, right? You can see a lot of particles here. Yeah, you will see a big trail whenever you're using DLSS, but not when you're using frame generation, which is quite nice. And as you can see, 120 FPS, but a lot of people aren't playing at 1080p resolution with a 4070 Super, right? So let's try it at 1440p. Here we go, 2560 by 1440 is now the resolution. We're using DLAA once again and the high settings. And well, I think to no one's surprise, we're getting 50 frames per second around that, so a 20 FPS drop coming from 1080p resolution. Previously it was at 60 to 70, now it's, yeah, 50 to 60, actually dipping down into the 40s a little bit more often than I expected, but it's still a playable experience. Once again, this is kind of like an interactive movie, doesn't require fast reactions whatsoever, so 40 plus FPS is absolutely enough for the type of game that this is. Doesn't feel too bad because of the motion blur as well, that helps smooth out the image, and if you play with the controller, even better, you know, so maybe that's something to consider right there, you know. Also, I forgot to mention this, but you can definitely see that I disabled the black bars on top and the bottom of the screen. That also makes the game more intensive, because with the black bars, essentially you're not rendering full 1440p resolution or full 16:9 resolution, you know. It would be kind of like an ultra-wide experience. But yeah, I don't like that the game tells you that you're running at 2560 by 1440 with the black bars, and it's not really 2560 by 1440 because you're not rendering anything on those black bars. Anyways, you can see over here it's not dropping down into the 30s, which is nice, although 1% lows are at 38, so maybe it did and I didn't notice it. But yep, even in the most intensive scenarios, at least in my benchmark run over here, which is quite boring. Yeah, I know, I'm sorry, it's a linear title, we gotta get used to it. I hope at least this is informative for you. All right, so it did drop down into the 30s there in the cutscene. Not terrible of an experience once again. Anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and try it with some frame generation next. Enable that. Here we go. VRAM usage went up. The allocation is actually above 8 gigabytes at the moment, and the usage is at 7.5. So even an 8 gigabyte GPU should do a decent job at 1440p with frame generation enabled, like the 4060 Ti or 4060. And yeah, we're getting 70s and 80s input lag wise. It's kind of the same as we were seeing previously with like 40 FPS. You know, it's about half of the frame rate that you're getting. But in a linear title, slow-paced game like this one, single player as well, it doesn't really matter, the input lag delay. So yeah, I feel like this feels all right to me. This feels good, actually. A little bit better than it did in the native resolution. I'm gonna play through this section once again, though, using these settings, because again, I think these are the settings that I would utilize myself. So I'm just gonna put a little bit more time in seeing what's going on over here. In this section, VRAM allocation and usages are a little bit lower in this particular area than they were previously. The frame time graph isn't as stable as before. Like, at least I didn't see those little spikes that happen here and there with the frame generation enabled. This is weird, because usually when you enable frame generation in games, it smooths out the frame time graph. It doesn't make it stutter slightly more. But yeah, right now it's actually really smooth. Maybe it was just loading something. I don't know. It's UE5, so there's that. It's a stuttery engine for sure. Although, in terms of stuttering, this game actually fares quite well, right? It's not a bad stuttery mess like Fortnite is, for example. Like, I can't play Fortnite with ray tracing and lumen nanite enabled because it is a total, complete disaster of a stuttering mess, basically. It's completely unplayable. Yet this one, although, yeah, we're not really playing online with all of the people dropping in a big map and so on. That's more intensive, obviously, and harder to optimize. But yeah, it's not stuttering at all over here. And it's way more beautiful than Fortnite, or at least more technically impressive, right? Look at that water. Like, the water always gets me in this game, especially in the opening scene. It's absolutely beautiful, guys. Damn. All right, so we're getting 80s here, 79 on average, 65 1% lows, and also at these settings, the smoke is way more defined. Like, I can still see slight pixelation there, but it is way better, actually. Yeah, makes sense. Like, it's not 1080p anymore. It's 1440p, 78% higher resolution than 1080p is. So yeah, after the restart, we're back to this area. But before the cutscene, and it's a little bit more intensive, instead of 80 FPS, we're getting like mid-70s. Although right now it's back to the 80s. What happened? I probably triggered something. Or maybe it's the sun going down. Yeah, I probably triggered the sun to go down, and the FPS increased by a little bit. But anyways, 77 FPS average is what we get, 59 1% low. Sometimes it drops down into the 60s, but even then, the input lag is not too bad for the type of game that this is. Now, let's try to disable frame generation and use quality DLSS quickly here. It gets slightly lower FPS, actually. 10 FPS lower FPS than 10 FPS lower FPS. 10 FPS lower than the frame generation results. So that means that maybe every once in a while it will dip down into the 50s with quality DLSS at 1440p resolution. A little bit of a shame, you know, but again, considering the game is super, super intensive and very beautiful, it's kind of expected. Again, I think this is more of a tech demo than anything else, especially at the highest settings possible. Now, the smoke over here is once again way more pixelated because of the DLSS. I can totally notice that. It's a bit distracting, actually. Such a beautiful game everywhere, and then you look at these smoke effects, and yeah. It's probably why I wouldn't play with DLSS quality here, even at 1440p resolution. It might be a different story for the 4K resolution, but yeah, here, I wouldn't do this. Also, the particle effects aren't showing any ghosting around them, which is interesting. Maybe it's only when we go down to like performance DLSS that starts happening. No? Alright, that's really weird, because with the 3080 Ti, I believe, I set it to performance DLSS at 4K resolution, and it was showing a lot of trailing around the particle effects in this same section of the game as well. Alright, now let's enable quality DLSS and frame generation on top of it, and yeah, this is back to a high refresh rate experience, as you can see. Not all of the time, but it is above 100 frames per second very, very often. It's going to be the average, like 100 plus FPS. That's a really sweet experience once again, but on a 1440p monitor, I think you might start noticing that picture quality degradation from having quality DLSS, which is a lower internal resolution again, plus frame generation, which softens things just slightly. You know, the couple of them combined, it shows quite a bit softer of an image, basically. But yeah, in this one, I think I would just stick to the native resolution plus frame generation, so you don't have a lot of pixelation in the smoke effects, and it actually looks really, really good still, and it's a smooth experience, and given that it's a single-player game, again, input lag doesn't really matter too much. That's it for the 1440p resolution, then let's bump it up to 4K and see what it can do. Alright, here we go, guys. 3840 by 2160 resolution using DLA. It's already getting 25 FPS in this menu right here, and look at that. I think this isn't surprising. It's getting 20s. It's not gonna achieve 30s anywhere, probably. Yeah, it's pretty bad. It's actually pretty close to the 3080 Ti here at 4K probably, because that has a higher buzz width and so on, higher bandwidth than this GPU does. This usually does a little bit better at lower resolutions than 3080 Ti, and then they're kind of the same at 4K, and sometimes the 3080 Ti is slightly faster at 4K as well. That's why it kind of makes sense that that 1080p was doing better than that card, and here at 4K it's kind of the same. So yeah, this is a pretty terrible experience to be expected, because even my 4080 Super was struggling. Although I tested that GPU in a different area to this one, it was in the beginning section of the game with a lot of waves around us and a lot of water effects and stuff like that. Although it was very, very similar in performance to the area over there with the smoke effect. So there's that. But yeah, even the 4080 Super was dropping from 30 FPS sometimes. Yeah, this game is really, really intensive. Let's enable quality DLSS here at 4K though, and it should put us at around the same values as the 3080 Ti did. Yep, 40 FPS, that's exactly the same thing, I think. So it's going to be playable here with DLSS quality. It's kind of the same experience as the 1440p resolution native, you know, which kind of makes sense because quality DLSS at 4K renders the game at 1440p and then it upscales it to 4K, and it does look way better than 1440p does at native res, by the way. This is... yeah, the 4K experience is such a gorgeous one. This is why, in my review of the 4070 Super at 4K resolution, I actually did end up recommending it over much more expensive GPUs, because here with this one you're spending $600 and you can actually have a decent 4K experience with DLSS quality and sometimes with frame generation as well. And at 4K, DLSS quality still looks really, really good. Okay, so 37, 36... it will drop into the mid-30s basically at its worst over in this area. Pixelation-wise, I can still see it with DLSS quality, guys. Let me just disable DLSS and see if I can still see some pixelation even at native res. Because at this point, no, yeah, that doesn't happen at native res at all. And at least at the 4K res, okay? So it's just down to DLSS. It makes the smoke effect way more pixelated, yep. Alright, anyway, let's try it with performance DLSS, because I tried this with the RTX 3080 Ti, and it wasn't capable of achieving 60 FPS plus. Apparently this one is exactly the same thing. Obviously I still haven't triggered the sun to go down or whatever, and it is performing a little worse right now. Yeah, it gets high 40s, low 50s. Yeah, it's not good, you know, and the performance DLSS, once again, at 4K resolution, isn't showing those trailing effects on the particles, whereas with 3080 Ti, it was super noticeable. That's so weird. Maybe something was broken there. The smoke is still a bit pixelated, obviously. Let me check over here. Yeah, definitely a little bit more than quality DLSS. But since it can't get 60 plus all of the time, I would just stick to the quality DLSS stuff. Because right now you got a lot of aliasing in a lot of different areas of the image, and especially on moving things like your character, when you do this, you can see a lot of noise and pixelation there. So let's go back to quality DLSS and frame generation on top of that. And right now we can finally see 60 plus frames per second, at least in this area right here. Given that it is very close to 60 most of the time, I will say it will drop from 60 frames per second sometimes, and at that point, even though this is a single player title, I don't think I would play like that because of the input lag addition. Maybe with a controller it will be alright, but here, guys, I'm just not feeling it. And once again, those little tiny spikes in the frame time graph are back, which is really weird. Must be something wrong with the frame generation implementation in this game, because if I do this, it just becomes worse. Anyway, yeah, this is not good. Obviously, if you disable DLSS, set it to DLAA again, native resolution with frame generation on top is just a bad idea. It gets 40s. Input lag is pretty much the same as half the frame rate, so it feels really bad. You really are better off just using quality DLSS and no frame generation. But lastly for this video, performance, DLSS frame generation enabled. And now we can finally get those sweet 60 plus FPS. Doesn't look too bad, honestly. Like, it's still reasonable in terms of visuals, but on my 32-inch monitor I can notice a lot of softness. It's a way softer image than it was with DLSS Quality. So pick your poison, I guess. Do you prefer 40 FPS with DLSS Quality and pretty much the same as native resolution visuals in terms of crispiness and sharpness? Or do you prefer a buttery smooth experience with 60 plus all of the time, but with a bit softer visuals and a bit of pixelation or more pixelation here and there? Honestly, I don't know what I would choose. If I had like a 28-inch monitor or 27-inch monitor, I'd probably choose this one, but with a 32-inch monitor or higher, and I am using a 32-inch right now, I'd probably use Quality DLSS. Alright, now that's been it. Thanks very much for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll catch you in the next one very soon. As always, love you all. Bye-bye.